Chronicles of a Play Therapist podcast is raw, unfiltered, and unapologetic, discussing mental health from a play therapy specialization, including trends, treatment approaches and techniques, theory, and the business of psychotherapy practice. Get ready to learn and play with your host, licensed clinical social worker and registered play therapist supervisor, Althea T. Simpson.
Thank you for being here.
Yes, Althea. Again, thank you so much for having me. I am Dr. Ajita Robinson. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. I'm a grief and trauma specialist, and so my substantive area of both clinical and research expertise really focuses around cumulative trauma and the aspects of racial trauma as well for urban youth and how that shows up across the lifespan. As you mentioned, Althea, that grief process does not expire, which means that we often accumulate losses that can be traumatic that also show up in adulthood and throughout our life. And so I lead a wonderful team of clinicians here in Bethesda, Maryland. And when I'm not doing that clinical work, I also serve as an income strategist for mental health professionals and corporations. And so really, really excited to have this time with you.
Yes, thank you so much. And so I'm going to put you on the spot because hopefully I can have you back for your coin collectors because you are the therapist and you do a lot of work with helping therapists monetize their gifts and their skills. So I'm going to put you on the spot to try to get you back for the business of psychotherapy episode because
Anytime.
I a business of psychotherapy episode of Chronicles of a Play Therapist once a month.
Excellent. Anytime. I'm always happy.
All right. So we are going to talk about grief in children today. So can you tell us a little bit about, or as much as you want, about children and grief and their developmental needs? Because I think a lot of people forget that, and this is a podcast, although the layperson and parents can find it useful, but this is a podcast that's specifically for mental health professionals. So the developmental needs of a child is sometimes missed in therapeutic spaces as well. So, but overall, can you talk about how grief looks for children and what their developmental needs are?
Absolutely. And so I always like to kind of just start with the kind of correcting of a misassumption, right? Misinformation that we have about children as grievers is that one, that they don't grieve, or that they grieve and they're like many adults. And that is just fundamentally untrue. And it often perpetuates why we miss them as grievers. And so grief for children, both young children as well as adolescents, they have a particular way in which they grieve that may also be truncated by their developmental capacity, which is different from their chronological age. This changes the way that, or influences the way that they express their grief. Sometimes, again, if we're not careful, we overlook the ways that children grieve because we impose language on their expression when you know this very well as your expertise as a play therapist, that it is usually the play or the behavior or the other non-language based ways that our kids express their grief, including adolescents, right? I think sometimes we think that our adolescents don't do the behavioral cues around grief, and that, again, is just not true. I think it's also important to just acknowledge that kids have the capacity to understand death and dying. We do have to adjust our language to match their developmental needs, but they have the capacity to understand that. Younger kids, so kids kind of 6 and under, may not understand the permanence of death, but they can understand the concept, right? They can understand that, grandpa's lungs stop working, right? We often complicate the explanation because of our stuff, right? Our fear about how kids will be affected, our fear about what questions they may ask that we don't have the answers to. And so we end up erring on the side of not having the conversation. And so I think it's also, again, critical to address our understanding and belief systems about death and the changes, but also to understand that children grieve non-death related losses as well. We all do, but children aren't exempt from grieving symbolic losses as well. And so there are some kind of markers that we want to be mindful of. We know that our younger children are more likely to, from a developmental perspective, we are more likely to see regression in behavior. And so kids who may normally or prior to loss have been pretty, independent and self-sufficient, tying their own shoes, sleeping in their own bed, we might see a regression towards more attachment-related needs, which we often code as being clingy, disruption in sleep, bedwetting, failure to meet certain milestones that, again, can be loss-related and not kind of cognitive or neuroatypical kind of deficits there. And so those are just some ways we know that regression is a big one, right? That we often see with our kids across kind of that spectrum of, birth to early adulthood. And so I think those are pieces that are just important. We often see that children will act out whatever they're trying to make sense of, right? And so if there's been a change in the household due to parental separation or divorce, we see it in their play, right? We also see it in the concrete questions they'll ask, like who's picking me up from whatever the activity is, soccer or what have you. And that can be quite jarring in the case of someone dying and the child seems to be oriented around, well, who's going to pick me up or who's going to make me dinner, because they're trying to make sense of how this particular loss impacts their world. And that is developmentally appropriate depending on what their age is, right? Or any kind of cognitive, capacities that we're compensating for. And so I think those are pieces that are just important. We often notice the behaviors that we often target the behaviors that we're wanting to correct that feel disruptive, that feel attention seeking, that feel risk seeking even, right? And so, or the disruptive ones usually come up first. So the inability to concentrate, not finishing tasks, difficulty with academics, right? Socialization. Those are all things that we normally kind of catch, but we don't necessarily code them as grief responses. And those are things that can just get in the way of us being able to honor that children are grievers, and their grief does not look the same as adults.
Absolutely. And thank you for that explanation and telling us the importance of the developmental stages, because again, just like you said, is kids nowadays, I always say that sometimes they just seem like they've been here before. Mm-hmm. but that gets missed, especially when they are, they have a high IQ and it gets missed. The developmental aspects of them socially get missed, and that can be harmful to their emotions. And when I think about, so I don't want to go down this line too much, but I want to just mention it. So, and even when grief, so we talk about the different types of grief, and in traumatic grief, I think kids get missed even more so. So you mentioned how they get missed in the grieving process, but I think when it comes to homicides, they really get missed because the parents are grieving and the other adults are grieving because of the shock of a homicide. And then the kids get left out. And again, you see these issues with school, issues at school, these behaviors start manifesting. And so they are homicide survivors and co-victims, and they're underserved as well, but they have specialized needs, right? Because of the trauma that's associated with it and the long-term psychological impact. As mental health professionals, we have to help them cope with their grief while helping them to restore control in their lives and teaching the parents the importance of, providing that safety and that security, because the sudden, violent, and preventable nature of homicide deaths can make these losses very traumatic for the survivors. And it can have, so many other effects that complicates a child's grief. And so I think that that's something that, that when we're doing grief and understanding, mental health professionals have to understand the different types of grief. And you can't treat traumatic grief the same way that you would treat uncomplicated or complicated grief, because their needs are disrupted. Their need for safety, their self-esteem, their need for control, their trust, their intimacy, self-identity, all of those things are negatively affected by someone else. The grief is just different when your loved one is taken at the hands of someone else. And then even with the climate today, the social climate today, what happens with kids who have to grieve, but then the death of their parent or loved one is publicized.
Oh, absolutely. All of these pieces. So you're talking about, I think, a lot of things that can complicate the grief process. And anytime we are dealing with traumatic grief or the violent death of someone, whether we've witnessed it or we've been a victim or vicariously, we have to take a layered approach. And so I always talk about grief being the naming aspect of traumatic losses. And so just being able to name and tell what happened, right? Because so often we don't have an opportunity to name that we've lost, right? That there has been a loss, and that there is a story there, right? A story that can be very painful because of the how and the what and the who, right? That can be disenfranchised. That's often disenfranchised because of our social climate, because of our social political world, right? And so that's one part of it. And then the trauma work is really the unpacking and the processing and stabilization aspect, which again, as you mentioned, is critical because we cannot do grief work. We cannot establish post-loss stabilization if we do not first establish safety. And that has been fundamentally disrupted psychologically, physically, emotionally. There's wounding there is now complex. And so we have to do the stabilization work. What often happens is that people go after the processing and the meaning making. We see this happen when in these very kind of public steps is generally as a function of one's faith or spirituality, or because we've been socialized towards forgiveness, we immediately move to the meaning making in the honoring phase, right, of the process. And we've kind of skipped through the other pieces around you get to be angry, you get to be upset, you get to be shocked and in disbelief, but there's very rarely room to express that in a way that isn't judged and that there's safe space for. And that is also true for kids. I think one of the big things that's important to note is that kids do get lost because we are often in survival mode. When a violent loss or death happens, as the adults in the situation, we're often in survival mode, and the kids, they are aware of that, right? And we may not be available emotionally to really attach or attune to their needs, and it leaves them to self-soothe, right? In the immediate aftermath, and self-soothe in a way that may not be as adaptive for them. That doesn't mean that we can't, come back, right, after we've been able to stabilize ourselves so that we can help the kids, but we just often miss them. And so I think that's a very important point to make, especially just the sheer amount of exposure to traumatic material and content. So the loss of safety and potential traumatic grief doesn't even have to be a result of something that actually occurred. It could be the threat of something occurring, right?
Yes.
And this current climate is very rich with emotional, psychological, and physical injury, particularly for our folks who belong to marginalized groups and communities.
Absolutely. And I think that what you mentioned is important too for mental health professionals to know is that when it comes to trauma and grief, I mean, there are different types of trauma, there are different types of grief, there are different scales, there are different assessments. The training aspect is so important, and you can't lump everything into PTSD because what you said about the threat of harm, that's it. And especially in our climate today, that's more race-based traumatic stress, the mere threat of being Black, right? That I can be harmed, and that can cause stress and a grief reaction because it's really a loss of freedom, so to speak, because I have to fear going out. I have to fear going to the store. I have to fear driving down the street. So what I retreat and I stay, in a place that minimizes my contact with not just law enforcement, but other people who, have a problem with my skin being Black. And so all of those things, and people think that grief is just you have to grieve the death of someone. That's not grief. That's a very small part of grief.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is these physical losses are the ones that we I think most commonly recognize, and we often also have rituals and resources around, right? And so we know what happens after someone dies. We know how to support people to some degree, right? After someone dies, usually there's a funeral, there's there's food, there's all of these kind of things that we know, even when there's these nuances, right? Whereas the same doesn't often occur in the case of, let's say, when there's a injury that happens at work that's more psychological, right? That often happens for marginalized communities and individuals who are in toxic workplaces. We have no way of acknowledging them, right? We really don't. We in the immediate aftermath of even just parental separation and divorce, that is a symbolic loss that might have some physical components such as loss of home, usually loss of stability, loss of routine, things of that nature. It might result in the loss of a relationship with a parent, right, because of proximity or a variety of other reasons. And we don't generally we don't have enough groups, right, or resources to support individuals navigating that process, right? Or right now, in the midst of this pandemic, we, I think, are minimizing the loss of routine, the loss of income, the loss of milestones. Our kids are missing extracurriculars, the socialization, the individuation from their families of origin, their parents, because they're not able to do that peer relational building and skill building and identity development that happens when they're able to be in close community with peers. And so all of those pieces are kind of being disrupted right now for many people. And I don't think that we're really able to acknowledge and support, right, kids in the way that they really need intentionally, right? And I think evidence of that is the fact that for many of us across the country, we've returned to a normal school day, which doesn't really honor the emotional and mental capacity of students and student learners and all that they're navigating, right, in this online space. And so I think there's a variety of ways that we can disenfranchise grievers, particularly kids.
Yeah, and one of the things that's disheartening to me is seeing the post and people saying, well, if your kids can play video games or they could watch those videos, reels on IG and all of these things, they can sit and learn for 5, 6, 7 hours a day on a computer. And that is just doing a disservice and so much harm to kids psychologically and emotionally, even with that mindset, because then you have parents who hear other people say this and then they take on that, knowing that this is not good for my child. And I think and it's horrible. I mean, I go to school once a month from 9 a.m. to 4:30 online because of the pandemic. And I'm like, what? You telling me that kids can endure this multiple days? I'm struggling with just one day a month. Right.
Listen, absolutely. And I'm a professor. I'm the one teaching and I am on the struggle bus. And so one of the things that's been really important is for me to be able to give my students, and I have all, similar to yourself, I have all graduate students, right? And it is rough. It is absolutely painful some days. Energy's low, migraines are high, concentration, the disruption in sleep, memory loss, even like it is a full body experience and we are inundated. The other thing that I think is important about grief, particularly grief that can become traumatic, is trauma is about the loss of safety and stability, right? Yes. At its very core. And what's being amplified here in this pandemic is that there's no end, right? And so oftentimes when we're navigating difficult situations, even potentially traumatic situations, there's the perception that there is an end, right? Those who are navigating, whatever the situation is, there generally is something that buffers it, right? So for kids who are in potentially abusive or neglectful households, school used to be an escape for them, right? For folks who are in experiencing intimate partner violence, work used to be an escape. And now there's no barrier, right? Yep. Or no buffer. There's no escape right? From the day to day, whatever they're inundated with, it's just present and it's pervasive with no end in sight, right? And that is the case with this pandemic that I think we got to pivot. We got to, that's a whole other conversation, but I think that we cannot minimize what people are actually experiencing and how it's showing up in the body, which further compromises our ability to remain healthy, to feel safe, to be able to have the resources to engage in online learning, right? To be able to have the resources to thrive in the middle of whatever the grief or the loss kind of situation is, including this pandemic. And so I don't think that we have, it's just easier to kind of push people through and to pretend that we're just working from home or we're just doing homeschooling. And it's just not true.
Yeah, it's not. And I think, like I said, I just feel for these kids that a lot of people don't recognize, because I think they compartmentalize, a lot of adults compartmentalize and just put it to the side. So they think that children have that maturity to do the same thing. And it's just like, oh, you don't have to get up and leave the house to go to school, so you should be okay going online. No, there's so many, they're developmental needs, right? So they're not developing emotionally, socially, the way that they need to with that in person. But working, I think working through the difficult feelings can become easier with time and through that support in open conversations. And so as mental health professionals, what would these conversations look like working with grieving children? For the children, what would they look like? The conversations look like for the children that's receiving services, as well as the consultation of the parents to help them to continue what is being learned in therapeutic spaces at home?
Yeah, so I really love this question, Althea. So I think part of what we need to do with kids is to honor their expression of grief. Mm-hmm. And so part of this might also be creating a space where they can try some things out. There are some kids who are very verbal about their feelings and they want to talk it through, but many of our kids need a different outlet. And so part of what we're doing as mental health professionals is giving them access to tools. And so whether that be art or music or movement or, play, whatever that is, we need to give them access to different mediums and then help them identify language to express what is showing up for them. And so being able to name their feelings, being able to express what's happening, helping them attune with how that is stored in their body, because it's 100% there. We know that it often shows up physiologically and just from a physical perspective in the body well before we're able to code it in language, right, and express that verbally. And so helping them become aware of the triggers. Also, I think normalizing the range and spectrum of emotions. Loss is not just the sad, sorrow, disbelief, anger, shock, anxiety. All of those are normal experiences of loss, but there's also joy that shows up and it sits right alongside the grief, right? There's also hope. There's also resiliency, encouragement, inspiration, laughter, happiness even. And we often feel guilty about experiencing that spectrum. And it is both natural and normal and needed on the grief journey. I think it's also important, particularly in our work with kids, is that we help them create meaning, that we're not leading the process. Even with kids, we are companions. And so we are curious about what things mean for them. We are curious about what they believe and what they understand, but that we also provide space for them to say goodbye, right? To work out what it means for them in the face of, in the aftermath of this loss. What does it mean about how they want to be taken care of? How can their parents recognize, or their caregivers, whomever they might be, recognize when they need support that isn't just the behavior, right? And so I think we really just kind of wrap them with not only language, but space to feel the full spectrum of their experience. I think the other piece for everyone is that we really take this limit off of the grief journey. The grief itself is not anchored by time. And so I think we impose that it will get better over time, that there's closure. Those are actually very unnatural to the grief experience. And what it does is that it sets us up to think that there is some time in the future, right? For many of us, we feel like it should be sooner rather than later, where we will no longer be affected by the loss. And what happens is that each anniversary, milestone, and, holiday, other trigger, even the trigger that didn't exist before, this could be another loss, sends us can send us back through the grieving process, right? And we feel unanchored and caught off guard and feeling like we should be better, right? Whatever that means on this grief journey, because we have the false assumption that it ends. I like to give the kind of example of when you have an infant, right? You're holding a baby for the first time. You're a little bit more cautious, right? The way that you cradle their head, you're a little bit more protective. You have a certain body posture. I have my arms in a cradle position right now, just talking about it, because that's how we hold babies, right?
Yes.
They need more support. We're very aware of their head, their soft spots, right? About getting their needs met because they are reliant on us to take care of them, right? And so that can feel like a lot of work, right? We are literally responsible for their life because they have no control or no opportunity to keep themselves safe, right? So that can be a lot of work for new parents, right? Or for anyone kind of encountering little babies. Now, that toddler, right? I have a 5-year-old. He is rambunctious, right? But if I need to carry him, I can throw him right up on my hip because I know that he's learned to wrap his legs around my waist. He will wrap his arms around my neck, and I can have one arm, right? And my purse in the other hand, and we are moving and moving, right?
Yes.
But my body, right, he's a 45-pound baby, right? A 45-pound toddler, much bigger than he was at 6 pounds, right? When he was first born. But my body has adjusted to the weight of carrying him on my hip, right? That little dip that is created it's meant right there for carrying this toddler. That wasn't really there in the same way. I didn't have the same physical capacity to carry that toddler when he was first born. But over time, I developed capacity to handle the weight in a way that didn't destabilize me. It wasn't overwhelming, right? Because over time, I built up the strength and the muscle memory as he grew. It's still there and it is still a weight. We're just able to carry it differently. And I want people to think about this with respect to the grief process. It is still there. Instead of it feeling like an elephant sitting on your chest, it might be that, that little crawl that slides down your arm every now and again, that little tension that might sit at the base of your neck and your shoulder, right? It might every now and again just flare up and make you feel like you have flu-like symptoms, right? That's what happens to me right on the eve of a grief anniversary is I feel like I have the flu, right?
Yes.
And I want us to think about that differently because it doesn't fully go away. It gives us permission also as parents, as caregivers, as grievers, as educators to feel what we're feeling across this journey. Our downtime or the weight might be a little bit lighter as we navigate the journey, but it doesn't ever fully go away.
And I think self-care, and people taking care of themselves and, having self-care practices. But a part of self-care practices is acknowledging that that's what it is, especially once you recognize it. And you may not recognize it. For some people, they may not recognize it right away. And I can just say this, a couple weeks ago, I was feeling like some kind of way. I couldn't put my finger on it. And, I go to my Legos, I go to my sand tray, I go to my gingerbread man and all of these things. But this particular day, I didn't have time to do that when I woke up and wasn't feeling like my best. And it was, and so I went on because I do, grief assignments at corporations and critical incident response. So I did this and it was my grief. It was a grief anniversary for me. I didn't recognize it until later that evening. So that morning I was at an organization doing grief counseling. And then that evening I had from 6 to 8, I did my 911, what's the emergency Black kids grieving training, which is about, traumatic grief of kids who lose their loved ones to a homicide. And it wasn't until halfway through that training that I remembered that it was the anniversary of the death of my brother. And so I was like, you know what? And so I got through the rest of the training, but I shut everything down the next day to honor myself.
Mm-hmm.
Right, to what I was feeling, what I missed, and all of those things. And so I think people have to have these practices for themselves, but the grief can become more intense and settled in the body if you try to avoid it. But that's where some people are. And for a long time, I put my grief in a box on a shelf because I didn't want to deal with it. Right. And so,
absolutely.
And so grieving is different for everyone, but we have to find a way to, make sure that we are honoring our own emotions and feelings about that. And there's nothing wrong with seeking counseling or therapy to do this, and especially for children. And I like what you said when you said that, it's like a companion, we're like companions to children. And so that has to be a part of therapeutic treatment for mental health professionals. I know, like, when you're working with children, I know we try to set up boundaries and like, I'm the professional, this is my client, but this client is still human. But then you have this child who's a little human and still need that nurturing, right? They still so there has to be some, and this is just the way I practice. I'm not saying that other people have to practice this way, but you have to think about it, that their need for nurturance and security and safety does not go away because they step into our therapeutic spaces and we are professionals.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I just think that it's important for us, for anyone that's working with children, to understand that they are not little adults. They are still kids that need safety, security. They need that prodding. They need that praise. And as a mental health professional, if your only mindset is like, look, I'm just going to be in here 45 minutes to an hour. This is what we do so I can, get my coins or bill and get it done, then children, I don't think that children is the population for mental health professionals who don't want to give that extra time and energy that's needed to help them move through the issues that they come to therapy for.
Yeah, I think that grief work in general requires a different space, right?
Yes.
And then grief work with a different way of being with people, that sometimes our training as mental health professionals teaches us to hold this boundary. And I don't mean from like, a perspective that creates a dual relationship that harms the client, but I mean, it forces us to hide behind our credentials and our expertise when grief works requires that we step into our client's world and that we are not leading. We are not the expert in their journey. We might be at best a safe space. We may provide framework for the work. We can even help with regrounding them. But the reality is, even our clients who dissociate during the grief process or during the trauma processing, the body dissociates all the time, right? We make the assumption that the body is not geared towards survival, and it is. And so clients will reorient themselves if we don't impose this structure. And with grief work, we have to be very careful about the goals that we set for grieving people, because we can unintentionally impose timelines or metrics that clients have already inherited because of societal norms, right? And so we want to be mindful that we don't impose that structure, linear process on a very nonlinear. I would even argue that grief is curvilinear, right? At best, right? Yeah. And that it is, not only is it okay, it is very adaptive and natural that we revisit different aspects of the grief journey as we attempt to make meaning and as we just move throughout our life, right? I think that piece is important. And we also have to honor our loss history. Oftentimes we are focused on the present loss, but we don't think about the losses that we have accumulated that may be unresolved or that often influence our capacity to grieve the current and future losses. The other piece is that, in the midst of kind of chaos and grief, right, our regular daily stressors didn't go away. We just weren't able to attend to them. And so those things show back up as we're trying to navigate the grief journey. And so what many of us do is that we work ourselves. We busy ourselves through the grief journey. We don't actually do the work. And it's the reason that it shows up at night when we're exhausted in the mind, and the body's like, oh, you slow down, here you go, deal with that piece, right? Or we go on vacation and you're like, wait, why did all of this stuff show up? It's like, well, because you had been actively working at pushing it away. And again, the body is geared towards survival and repair, and grief work is restorative.
Yes.
And so it will do the work it needs to do, whether you engage in the process or not. And so don't make it hard on yourself. You do not have to be on fire to say you want support, you want companionship, you want someone to just bear witness to the journey. A lot of times, and this is the thing that particularly complicates grief for children, is that it is the unsaid and the undone that complicates our grief journey when the loss itself was not complex, right? And it creates these secondary losses that, again, often are not named. And so we don't have an opportunity to grieve them, or we don't receive the support that we need because we aren't even able to acknowledge that they are also part of the grief journey. And so we really want to make sure that we're creating a space for that we're not focusing on moving our clients through their feelings, that we're giving them room to feel all of them, right? And to not shy away from it, and for us to not be, we have a really hard time sitting in silence and sitting with these difficult feelings, even as professionals, because we want to help. And for grief work, the best thing that we can do is provide a safe framework to be a good witness and companion.
And that's the therapeutic intervention in itself. I think a lot of mental health professionals, especially with play, using expressive therapies like play therapy, they think that they have to be doing something, but providing that safety, that stability, that consistency to allow them to grieve and allow them to be in therapeutic spaces, that's the intervention itself. And they get stuck in, I am supposed to be doing something more. No, that goes back to, again, our training, training, supervision, consultation, knowing that it's okay for you to give them their space, right? You're honoring them, you're creating that space for them. And I like how, play is the child's language, right? And so if we give them an opportunity to do this in therapeutic spaces, like you said, it can, teach us or take us into their world and learn about their needs, their grief, and their joy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so what do you think about children, helping children find ways to keep the person's memory alive in their healing process?
So I think symbols are excellent. I think that, and so symbols, they can be physical or just symbolic, right? And so my grandfather's watch, right? His necklace, his notebook, things like that. We often set a place for him at the table around our big holidays. We tell stories, right, about him. We have photos and memory books. All of these things are things that we can do to remain connected, right? I always talk about the physical connection may have ended, but the relationship never dies. And so for kids, especially ones who never had an opportunity to say goodbye, depending on their faith tradition or what have you, you would modify this exercise. We've had a lot of children that have benefited from being able to write letters to their loved ones, as well as to being able to make phone calls to heaven.
Yes.
Whatever that kind of looks like, again, it gives them a way to prayer, right? Again, we always respect and adjust for the client's belief system and what their resources might be. And so for many of my clients, prayer is a resource. And so feeling like they can connect with their loved one in that regard. And so, this might be an attachment to places that they visit, that they, would visit with their loved ones, or that they will visit in honor of their loved ones. Kids have also been really instrumental in starting foundations or causes as a result of their own loss, right? So the loss of a peer, We often talk about children losing a parent or a family member, but children losing a peer can be very destabilizing for them because we
Yes.
don't think about other children dying, right? And so being able to do something in honor of their classmate, sometimes that has been, I've worked with kids who've lost classmates due to gun violence, due to cancer, due what have you. And they've done amazing things that have been in honor of that person. So starting library scholarships, what have you, right? And so giving them opportunities to honor the loss is important. But we put together kind of grief kits. Depending on the age, it might include like a bear, right, with weights, because it gives that sensory input, right? As well as when we can, we might, make up the vest or the shirt for the bear out of a loved one's clothing, right? So that kind of connection, both scent and touch and sight, are kind of activated and can be very enriching there, right? And so involving them in whatever the ritual or the routine might be related to the loved one is important. They have the capacity, they deserve to be included, and it absolutely does help them with feeling connected and feeling supported.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for going into details about some of the ways that you work with children in grief or clients in grief, because Chronicles of a Play Therapist, I want to offer skill building because I want people to use play therapy responsibly. It is a process to be trained as a play therapist. And a lot of people say that they are using play therapy in their practices and in their treatment. And some people are just playing in therapy because they can't make the connection to why they're using things. And that was one of the reasons why I started Chronicles of a Play Therapist, so you can go from theory, you can know about different techniques and strategies and why you're using them. And so that's why I love doing activities, with the podcast as well. And a great activity for grief is always the colors of my heart, which can be done in so many ways. But another one that I really like is like drawing your feelings, where you use a flower cutout or coloring page. You help the child or children write an emotion on each petal that illustrated, on one side. And then, you have the emotion on one side and you illustrate that emotion on the other side. And you might ask questions like, what have you drawn? Can you tell me a story about it? How do you feel when you look at each side of this petal? And then you can talk to them about their emotions and their feelings. You can use glue sticks to make it into a flower. And this activity helps kids, it reminds kids that feelings of sadness and a lot of other feelings can come and go, so it's okay if it goes away and comes back. You didn't do anything wrong because it came back, right? So feelings come and go. And then you might want to repeat this activity over time to create a whole garden of feelings for kids around their grief. And so I like giving the activities connected to what I'm talking about, again, to make those connections about why I'm using these things and being more responsible with what we're doing with clients, because if we're not, that can be more harmful. And so, and this activity can be coupled with bibliotherapy. I absolutely love bibliotherapy. And two of my favorite books around grief are When Dinosaurs Die and Sad Isn't Bad. And so I just encourage mental health professionals that want to incorporate the therapeutic powers of play, because play therapy is very powerful. It's very powerful. Play therapy and other expressive therapies like art, singing, music, drama, but just being responsible when we are and intentional. So I want them to be intentional about activities that they choose with kids. And again, that was the whole purpose of me starting Chronicles of a Play Therapist. I love play therapy. I love talking about play therapy. I love using play therapy for myself and with clients. So, but Thank you so much, Dr. Ajita, for joining us today on Chronicles of a Play Therapist. Now, tell us about, because you have a grief book and you have a box. So tell us a little bit about your book and your box.
Yeah, so The Gift of Grief, A Practical Guide on Navigating Grief and Loss it's just that. It was written for the everyday person, but it also provides great framework for clinicians. And it's a great resource for bibliotherapy. And so it is very accessible. And so that we talk about a variety of things. We talk about different factors that contribute to the loss, different types of loss, how children grieve specifically, how social media even can impact our grief. Again, there's a variety of different chapters that also comes with a free course companion that includes videos and other resources, such as a grief kit, things like that. The wellness box is actually created really to help my team feel more connected and to help take care of themselves. That's kind of how I started sourcing different products, but I wanted to be very intentional about things that would help increase their mental health and wellness and kind of help them with routine. And then other people kept asking me about it. And so I made it available. And now it's a quarterly box. We're in the process of curating our our December box, which we'll close orders mid-November. But it really is taking into consideration what are the different tools that we might utilize that we actually will use that increase our mental health. And so it's not just your bath salts and, lip balms and teas, but thinking about it as for the December box, thinking about what are the unique mental health needs of people during this time of year. We know that seasonal affective disorder is increasing. We know that, again, just depression in general, the colder months, they're generally isolated. So what are different things, even that our skin needs of us to be paying attention to, because all of that shows up. And so those are the types of things that are, I think leveraging the fact that I am a mental health professional and choosing different things to include in this wellness box gives, I think for me, an advantage, but also a level of intentionality that the folks who purchase the box will benefit from. And so that's kind of how that came about, was really finding a way to support my team as we've just been slammed, right? And being grief and trauma therapist is not easy work, especially in the middle of a pandemic where all of those things are amplified. And so I knew that other folks could benefit from it. So all of those things are at ajitarobinson.com. The book is ajitarobinson.com/book. And the box can be found at the gift-box.com, but also on my website.
Okay, thank you so much. And we will make sure that those links are in the show notes so people can just click and purchase. I love the intentionality part, just being intentional as mental health professionals. We have to be intentional in what we do. I think people have to be intentional, if you're intentional in what you do in any realm of your life can, blossom. But as mental health professionals, we have to be intentional about what we do. So thank you again, Dr. Ajita, for joining me on Chronicles of a Play Therapist. We are at the end of the show. You have been listening to Chronicles of a Play Therapist informational podcast with your host, Althea T. Simpson. Thanks for playing. And until next time, play well.
Chronicles of a Play Therapist is sponsored by Unicorn Life Play Therapy Academy, where play therapy is magical. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe in your favorite podcast app and follow us on YouTube. Chronicles of a Play Therapist is intellectual property of Althea T. Simpson. All rights reserved.